Hello, good morning, I guess, for you.
Yes, good afternoon.
Yes. So yes, we are here to talk about, well, um, the importance of science and of um, science as a basis for making decisions, especially with regards to genetic engineering right now and GMOs, something that I know you are quite interested in. Can we maybe start by just telling us what is GMO?
Okay, well, basically, GMO is a term that has been used to describe organisms that have been genetically modified by some specific recombination techniques, recombinant DNA techniques. It's actually a misnomer in the sense that everything on this planet has been genetically modified, including everybody in this audience. Every time we have a baby, the baby has been genetically modified as a result of the fertilization process.
Mm.
And if you look at the plants, the insects, everything around us, evolution takes care of making the genetic changes. But GMOs has become used specifically for things that we do in the laboratory in order to modify organisms.
Mm. And what is the difference between modification from evolution and what we do in the lab?
Well, in the lab, we do it deliberately. We, for the most part, know what we're doing. By evolution, it's all done by chance. It's whatever recombination processes happen to work and make an organism fitter and better able to live.
Mm.
So it's random processes.
Yeah, so one of the critiques against GMOs and using it is that there are unintended consequences, but aren't there unintended consequences with the random process as well?
Oh, even more, I would suspect.
Mm.
So, if you look at evolution, there are an awful lot of mistakes that get made along the way, but then the organisms typically don't survive very long. They become less fit, less able to compete, and so they disappear.
Mm. But with I know one term for you said the GMO is a misnomer. I know that you and other advocates of this technique use the term is it precision agriculture?
Well, yes, precision agriculture is a much better way of doing it, or precision breeding is a much better way, a much better term for it,
Mhm.
because what we do is we make precise changes in the organisms that we're working with, in usually for the most part plants we're talking about.
Mhm. What kind of changes are these? Can you give us some examples?
Sure, I think there are plenty of examples. One of the most widely used is to introduce resistance to pests. So, for instance, there was a big problem in sub Saharan Africa, not in South Africa, because of a disease called the fall army worm, which comes and eats all the corn crops. But there is a way in which you can prevent that fall armyworm from surviving by putting a gene for a bacterial toxin into the corn plant. And the gene is called BT. It stands for Bacillus thuringiensis. It's a
Mm.
naturally occurring insecticide, if you will. It's the one that's used by organic farmers, for instance, in order to stop insects from eating all their crops. But you can put the gene for that into the corn. It's completely harmless to man. We can eat it with no problems whatsoever. Animals can eat it with no problem. And yet it stops the fall armyworm from
Mm.
eating the plant. And so you can increase yields very often 10, 5 or tenfold just because of the fall armyworm, which has a voracious appetite and will eat it if you don't do anything. And the alternative would be to spray pesticides on the corn. And so, in this way, you have the advantage of the corn itself producing a pesticide against the fall armyworm, and we don't need to spray. And so, it saves the use of pesticides.
Yeah, that's normally not the but it's not the kind of story that you most often hear about GMOs. That it's
Yes,
actually
right.
that it uses less pesticide, and it feels it can be more. more organic in that sense.
But you have to realize that the people who are pushing an anti-GMO agenda are trying to scare you. And they've taken all of their lessons from Hollywood. You know, Hollywood knows how to scare you. And so the anti-GMO activists have also figured out how to scare you. But just because they tell you a story, it doesn't mean it's true. And in this case, it's simply not true.
Yeah, so that's my next question is, of course, so well, GMOs are safe, you say. How do we know that they are safe?
Well, we've been using them for 30 years now, and there's not one single problem that has emerged. And in fact, in Europe, where the population tends to be anti-GMO because of the activists, they in fact import millions of tons of GMO soybeans in order to feed the animals that then go to market and get eaten in the fancy restaurants throughout Europe. Apparently, the GMOs are perfectly safe for animals, but just not for us.
Right.
I wonder where the animal activists are on this.
Yeah, I guess. But I think that some of the unease about GMOs comes from and I guess that's the kind of thing that the people who are against GMOs play on, is that we perceive a difference between what's natural and what's artificial, and we don't like the artificial things. We like the natural things. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Are cell phones natural? People seem to like cell phones rather a lot.
Yeah,
You know, I mean, we live in a society in which almost everything that surrounds us is artificial. Even the food that you eat is the result of plant breeding. And plant breeding is made by crossing two plants that really typically don't necessarily cross with one another, but we force them to cross and hope that we get a desired trait. Maybe we want them to grow taller. But if that doesn't work, we typically use chemical mutagenesis, or we use X-radiation in order to try to mutagenize these plants to make them behave in the way that we want them to behave. Is that natural?
No, well, I don't know. I suppose not, or at least it doesn't seem like that. But I guess that it is, in the sense that
trust me, science says it's not.
Yeah, but those kinds of methods, they are still counted as in Europe. They're allowed, right?
Yeah. Just because we've been using them for a long time. But there are plenty of examples of problems that have come from that. So, you know, a lot of monogenic crops that have been produced that produce and work very well when they're first produced. After a while, all of a sudden they get wiped out by some insect that's figured out how to eat them.
But I'm also thinking, you mentioned pesticide producing plants. There are also ways to enhance, not only to be resistant towards disease, but to enhance the nutrient quality of crops. And I guess golden rice might be the best example. Can you tell us the story about golden rice?
Sure. So, I mean, golden rice is probably one of the best examples of sort of the whole story and the problems that have come from the anti-GMO people. So, you know, a tremendous number of people on this earth eat rice as their main source of calories. But unfortunately, if you eat rice, you tend not to get some of the nutrients that are particularly important for early childhood development. And one of those is a compound called beta-carotene, which is the precursor of vitamin A. Now, if children don't get enough vitamin A during the first few years of life, they tend to have autoimmune problems, other immune problems, but in particular, they have problems with their vision and very often go blind. And in the West, we typically have no problem with this. We either use vitamin supplements in the form of tablets, or we eat lots of carrots, or we eat lots of other vegetables that have beta carotene. And so for us, it's not typically a problem. But in much of the world, where they eat an awful lot of rice in the early days of life, they have a problem. They don't get enough beta carotene. And so two scientists, Peter Bayer and Ingo Petraikas, decided, well, maybe they could make a rice variety that could produce beta carotene. You have to remember, rice, the stems, the roots, and so on actually produce beta carotene, but it doesn't go into the grain that we eat. And so they tried to move those genes so that they would express in the grain. And they couldn't do that with the natural genes in rice. And there were obviously mechanisms stopping that. And so they took two genes from elsewhere, from another source, put them into rice and enable them to express in the grain. And they started this work back in the 1990s. By 1999, they had 93 rather, I'm sorry, they had a good source of it. They'd managed to move it by about, I would say 1995 or so. This could have been getting into the hands of the crop breeders and the farmers in order to improve its use for agriculture. But as a result of opposition from Greenpeace and the anti-GMO people, they put every conceivable obstacle in the way of getting this into the hands of farmers and then hence into the hands of the people who really needed them. And it was only this year, about 6 weeks ago, that this was finally approved for commercial production and for use in the Philippines. So it's taken all of this time in order to get it into the hands of farmers, and primarily because of opposition from the anti-GMO people. And I think one of the reasons that the anti-GMO people were so concerned about this, because they really focused on it with a laser-like beam to try to stop it, is because basically it's starting to look like a pharmaceutical. And of course, there are other pharmaceuticals that we produce from GMOs. One of the most notable one is human insulin. You know, people who are diabetic don't get their insulin from humans. They get it from a GM organism, a genetically modified organism. But that apparently is perfectly okay. So the anti-GMO people don't worry about that. And I think they saw golden rice as being the equivalent of a GM producing insulin. And it's very hard to be against pharmaceuticals. And so I'm hopeful that other countries will also adopt GM golden rice, and that this will become something that is a staple, is used widely, can protect against blindness in young children. And then we will see that there are other potential pharmaceuticals that could be produced in plants that would help the populations of the developing countries.
Yeah, I think that's a very good example of this. And when we talk about, you mentioned the anti-GMO people, I guess it's for someone who is convinced that this is not safe and that it's bad, it's probably hard to convince them otherwise. But the campaign that you are leading, I guess you're not directed towards convincing them, but to inform the public. So by informing us about how this works. Am I correct in that?
There's really two target audiences.
Okay.
One are the politicians, because the regulations governing GMOs and when you can make them, when you can use them, are usually written by politicians. And so also the general public, it's important that they know that this technology exists, that it's safe, so that then when they're voting for politicians, they can vote for the correct ones, the ones who support it, and not the ones who are trying to stop them from getting the benefits that can come from GMOs. And in particular, in the developing world, in Africa, where the population is booming, and they need more food. And so we can improve crops so that they give better yields. I mean, this is what's happened in the developed world. The big agricultural companies have gone for years trying to improve the crops that we eat. That same has not taken place in the developing world. And so now there is an opportunity to do that. And because the GM techniques are relatively simple, scientists in the developing countries can make improvements to the crops that the people in their country are eating.
How do you think that this? I mean, you mentioned before that um, the anti-GMO people use Hollywood scare tactics, and they have that on their side. There's a sort of inherent
Right.
fear of the unnatural, and sometimes maybe even fear of science in our society. And we certainly see that kind of resistance to science and facts growing these last years. How do you think do you think that enough scientists are speaking up against this, or do you think that more scientists should do that?
Well, so I definitely think more scientists need to do it.
Mm.
But I think one of the problems is when you look at the funding that has been obtained by the anti-GMO people, they have really enormous resources to push their message. And so this is why they've been so effective at scaring people. Scientists, on the other hand, have no money to support their cause. You know, we get money to support our research, not to go out and publicize how well we're doing and what we can do. And I think this is something that we need more scientists individually to get involved. So, for instance, scientists can go and talk at local schools. Children are by far the best audience for an awful lot of this message. For one reason, they don't get scared. They've not been a focus of the anti-GMO folks. They tend to be fairly sensible. They tend not to have a lot of preconceived views. And so I think they're much more open to listening to science, to scientists, and to facts. And one of the things we probably should do is actually teach scientists how to communicate with the public. An awful lot of them feel that, well, they have to use big fancy words and acronyms and things that are not well understood by the public. And when they're explaining what they do, because somehow they think this makes them look smarter. In my view, it does not. It does exactly the opposite. The smart scientists can talk in words of one syllable. I have something I call the grandmother test that I ask my students to participate in. I say, you should go home, talk to your grandmother, and explain to her what you do every day, what fun you have in the lab, but exactly what you're doing and why you're doing it. And you have to get that to a point where your grandmother really understands what you're doing, and she can then go and tell her friends how smart you are. This is the grandmother test. And I think most of us should learn how to talk to our grandmothers and explain exactly what we do. It's not that difficult to explain science in simple terms once you get a little practice at doing it.
Hmm. I guess, yeah, I guess it takes practice. But there's also, since we're talking to teachers here, there's a middleman, so to speak, between scientists and the children as well. That I mean, obviously educating teachers or educating, but having more communication between scientists and teachers. Is that
Well,
is that something that you've been, except from, of course, right now doing?
sure. No, I mean, I go around to local schools and give talks, and in the process, talk to the teachers as well. And many of the teachers are very open to this. But I had a very interesting insight from a talk that I gave not too long ago to a group of children who were between the ages of 11 and 14. And I went to school and talked to them about GMOs. And they'd all been told by the teacher that they had to write back to me afterwards and explain, you know, what they got from the talk and what they liked, what they didn't like. And I was surprised that quite a few of the children wrote back and said that, well, they really liked the talk because it was the first time they'd been spoken to as though they were adults. And I think this is something that teachers sometimes have a problem with, that they talk to the children as though they're children, not realizing that they're budding adults, and that by treating them and talking to them as though they were adults, that you can get a better response from them. And I was heartened by it. I'd never heard this before. This was the first time it had come up. But the best story that I got back from that day was a girl who wrote to me and said, well, she'd gone home and talked to her parents about what I'd been talking about. And her parents, who were anti-GMO, had listened to their daughter and had changed their minds. And they were now pro-GMO. And I thought, well, this is a lesson for all of us, that if we can get the facts through to children, if we can get them to understand that science is based on facts, and you don't want to listen to the lies that are being told you, either by anti-science people or by politicians or anyone else, that they are very open to facts. And they're not stupid. They understand when something makes sense and when something doesn't make sense. And so I think we do well to really make sure we educate our children about facts, about the importance of facts, and that facts are really based on good science, on experiments. They're not something that we make up.
Yeah, I think that I guess I think that's a very fair point. I said before that you're an advocate for GMOs, but in reality, you're also you basically by explaining the fact makes it advocacy, because the fact is that it's safe. And it's not only, of course, you who say this, but there are more than I don't know exactly how many Nobel laureates have signed your petition. Is it almost 200?
158 so
158. Yeah, that's. And I guess
it's
Nobel
quite a lot.
laureates, yeah, I guess Nobel laureates are people that we usually trust that they are good scientists.
Well, we hope so. At least the Nobel Committee does.
Yeah, and they should know. But I guess that's a point I want to bring up as well, that the Nobel Prize is, or at least we try to be a vehicle for these kinds of discussions as well. Do you think that might help people, scientists who maybe not that much engaged in doing this kind of work, but if Nobel laureates are doing it, of course they receive the prize, so they are more famous. But can you be sort of role models, not only for general public and young people, but also for other scientists, that you show that this is important?
Yes, I think there are quite a few of us who do that, but there are some who really get a little worried when they talk about things outside of their field. And so, you win a Nobel Prize and people listen to you and very often think that everything you say is fantastic and that you somehow have special knowledge. But in fact, we don't have special knowledge. We have special knowledge in our field. We have special knowledge about how science works and how conclusions are drawn from facts. But we don't necessarily have special knowledge about, say, the effects of vitamin A on childhood blindness, right? This was something I had to learn. This was not part of my upbringing. I was trained as a chemist, an organic chemist. I got into molecular biology and biology by chance because I was interested in it. And I got the prize in physiology or medicine, despite the fact that I'm not a doctor of the MD kind. And I don't have any special knowledge in this area. But I think while on the one hand, it's very nice that we have a platform and people like you teachers will sometimes listen to us, I think we also have to be rather careful that we don't say things and claim they're true when they're really not. And I think it's important that we express our limitations when we're talking. And for this reason, some of my colleagues just don't want to talk at all because they're afraid that people will listen to them and that they'll get it wrong.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think I have a question from a couple of questions from the audience. We have actually for this talk, especially this part in English, we have actually a quite wide audience. So I have a question from a teacher in Vietnam, actually, Trung An. She asks, we've touched upon this, but I think maybe sort of summary answer, not the end is, she wants to know what ethical terms should be considered with GMOs.
Well, I think the ethics are always based on risk and benefit, and that there is a morality here in the sense that one would like to make sure that the food that we eat is the best that it can be, that if there are GMO solutions to diseases like vitamin A deficiency and golden rice, this is a good thing. This is something we should be doing. But we should also recognize that there may be risks that we don't know about. They've just not shown up yet. We've not seen them. But I think if we focus too much on risk, we never take the necessary steps to improve society. So for instance, every time a new breed of corn is produced as a result of conventional breeding, we tend not to worry about the risks of that, even though the risks there may be even greater than through a new breed of rice or corn that comes from GM technologies. I think I like to use cell phones as the perfect example. You know, the uptake on cell phones has been enormous. Everybody now, you go to Africa, they've never seen, most people have never seen a regular phone because they've gone straight to cell phones. But cell phones have a problem. Cell phones, the screens actually produce a blue light that affects the retina and leads to early macular degeneration if you watch the cell phone too much without any shield to take out the blue light. You don't hear a lot of talk about that. This doesn't seem to be something that people are concerned about. The new vaccines against COVID, these were developed in record time. These are GMO products. We tend not to worry so much about that. And why? Because they have pharmaceutical benefit. But I would argue that when you're improving crops so that people can eat more easily, can get the food they need more easily, and that too is a pharmaceutical. You know, food is medicine for people who are hungry. They much more like to get a good dinner at night before they go to bed than they do to take an antibiotic, say. If you're hungry, food is what you need. And so I think we have always to think of risks and benefits, but let's not overwhelm ourselves worrying about risk. You know, skiing, a lot of people go skiing. Skiing is an accident waiting to happen. You ski, you have fun, you have your accident, and you stop. I think we always need to put risk within the larger context of what is good for society.
Sure. Yeah. I think maybe we shouldn't tell the anti-vaxxers that the vaccines are GMO based. I think that might be a problem. We have one more question from the audience here in Gothenburg.
Thank you very much for this very interesting discussion. I think it's a little bit similar about the ethics of scientific discoveries. So maybe can you give some example? The basis of the fear is probably that gene manipulation perhaps can be misused. So I think changing making a distinction between the technique as is and the application is maybe a key thing here. Can you explain a little bit if it's always safe to use gene manipulation, or can it be misused? Thanks.
Well, I've yet to find a technology that man has come up with that cannot be misused. I think Alfred Nobel is the perfect example. He invented dynamite, but he did it so that we could change the environment, change the surface of the earth to build roads and to better get around. But then the military got hold of it and they used it for all the wrong reasons. And of course, gene manipulation, we can use it for the wrong reasons. If we want to, we could take a particularly nasty poison, say ricin, which is a natural product that is found in certain plants. We could take the genes that produce ricin and put them into corn and make corn that was poisonous. But why would you want to do that unless you were a terrorist? And so I think we have to look at the difference between peaceful uses of things and moral uses of things and things that are clearly deliberately dangerous for terrorist activities or for others. I think the biggest problem at the moment that one needs to worry about are the genetic manipulation of humans. And that is something where I think there is a lot of ethical divide among scientists, among the general public, about what is okay and what is not. When you start to change the germline, for instance, as this doctor in China tried to do, for reasons that were really to try to increase his own fame and not for any direct medical benefit, that is not something we should be doing at the moment. But on the other hand,
Yeah, I think that's
Sorry?
a perfect way to. We have to move on in the program, and I know that there will be directly after this we'll have a debate where I think we definitely will be talking about these kinds of consequences. So it's a perfect way to end. Thank you so much, Dr. Roberts, for being with us today. It was really lovely to talk to you, and I think we're all more enlightened about the ethics and use of GMOs now. Thank you so much for being with us.
Okay, well, if anybody has questions that were not answered, please email them to me. I do try to deal with emails as much as I can.
Great. Thank you very much.
Okay,
Big
thank
hand
you.
for Professor Roberts from Gothenburg.